Cool. All right, guys. I'm going to show the presentation. And if you guys want to double click and to maximize the screen, so wherever you see that presentation, so that way you can actually kind of zoom in and view it. So we're going to start with the basics here. So one, design sprints are a 5-phase process. If you think about design thinking, having, let's say, 5 phases in terms of building empathy, in terms of defining the problem, coming up with ideas, building a prototype, and then testing those ideas. Sprints basically leverage those 5 phases, and then they do it in a compressed format. So they give you a very prescriptive way on how to run it. So day 1, explore the problem, build empathy, talk to people, define that problem. Day 2, do some ideation, do some solutioning. Day 3, make some key decisions around what are some of those ideas that we want to test. Day 4, build a prototype, and then day 5, bring in real people and test those ideas. So again, we're looking to use those human-centered principles in terms of talking to people, making sure that we're delivering solutions that are going to solve real problems for real people, in a way that allows us to kind of, test it fairly quickly so that we can get to some insights, we can get to some qualitative data. And then from there, we can know whether or not we're on the right track, if we've got to make adjustments, so pivot, persevere, pull the plug. Basically, where they work really well is when we're looking to perhaps, launch a new product or service and we want to validate it. So maybe we've got an idea, we want to kind of create something to simulate that idea, and we want to find out, how people will react to it once we put it in front of them. You can also use it for, solving a particular challenge. So perhaps if maybe you've got some issues in retention or let's say in growth on a specific application, for example. So, perhaps you've already got an existing product or service or a process, but you've got some challenges with that particular product or service, and you want to put a team together to kind of figure out, what the challenge is, put together some ideas, and then test those ideas. They're also really powerful if you're also just looking to build alignment. So maybe you've got some uncertainty, you've got some unknowns, and you want to bring a team together to figure out the strategy and kind of work through some of that uncertainty, but you're looking at really, building some alignment with that group. So, sometimes we get a lot of the business and IT can't necessarily, maybe they're not on the same page when it comes to the strategy, and sprints can be very powerful for getting people aligned, getting them on, moving in that common direction, building that shared understanding, those common goals. So when I said that sprints kind of take design thinking, and then what they do is they really create a prescriptive format that tells you, okay, this is what you're going to do on Monday, this is what you're going to do on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So it's a formula that's been proven, originally starting at Google Ventures. They used it on hundreds of organizations to really help launch and test startup ideas. Eventually, AJ and Smart started to adapt the process for enterprise organizations. So looking at, what works in bigger, larger companies, for example. And a lot of key learnings came out of that. It's still a fairly new process. Like for the most part, it's only been kind of popular in the last 3 or 4 years. The book came out in 2016, but it has been in adoption since about 2012. So lots of usage. If you're planning a sprint, obviously in the beginning, you want to make sure that you frame up the challenge. So being clear on what problem are we solving, and also what's the expectation. So what's the deliverable coming out of the sprint? Are we building a prototype? Are we building a presentation? Are we building a roadmap? Like, what are we actually building? So just so that everybody's on the same page, kind of going into the sprint. Having a small team, so the 2 pizza team, what you'd see in perhaps like let's say an agile team, for example, where it's a lot easier to start to make decisions, collaborate without having to necessarily split the group into smaller groups. So you want to have a small team of core people, but then invite key people that might have some perspective, some data, whether it's a client or let's say a subject matter expert, so that they can actually be interviewed by the core team. So a lot of times we get this challenge around, okay, everybody wants to participate in the sprint. Well, we say, okay, well, there's a core team, but then we can actually invite some of those folks and interview them and kind of get their perspective. Definitely the schedule, you want to, keep it time boxed as much as possible. So the traditional design sprint is 5 days. AJ and Smart has a 4-day version. If you're doing an iteration sprint, usually that can be also shortened a little bit because you're really focusing just on the feedback and making changes to the prototype. But really keeping it time boxed, and we'll walk through kind of what that looks like in terms of those activities. But ultimately, you're getting to a validated solution, right? A validated solution that's going to give you a lot of insights in terms of the problem that you're working on. So do you have the right problem? But also a validated solution in terms of, do people like it? Is it going to work for them? Is there any issues with it? What are the changes that we need to make? Keep in mind that this is qualitative data. So you're going to get a lot of, so for some teams that perhaps are already doing usability studies, usability sessions, that's a very common technique. So at the end of the sprint, we actually invite customers. We're looking for the power of 5, which means that, after 5, let's say customers or personas, the people that are our target audience, we start kind of getting diminishing returns in terms of any new information that they're giving us. So, we start to see patterns quite quickly if they start kind of explaining things that they don't like, or if it's not working, or if they're confused, for example. So that data can be quite powerful to let you know if you got to make some adjustments. But that validated concept is really the goal for, here's a problem, here's an idea, we're going to test this idea, and we've got some validation, and now we can make a better business decision. Just to kind of break down the activities, when I said they're basically sprint is composed of, highly facilitated workshop activities, and, each day has a set of activities. So in total, I think there's upwards of like, close to between 14 to 20 activities, and you can actually even customize them. So if you go to Google or Sprint with Google, they even have dozens and dozens of other ones that you can kind of plug and play. But the one that comes out of the book, it's good, especially if it's going to be your first time. Recommend definitely just running the recipe that comes with the sprint book so that you get familiar with it and you feel confident. And then afterwards, as you want, you can actually adjust the need of some of those activities depending on the problem that you're solving. So if you're focusing more on strategy, or if you're focusing on a product, for example, or if you're focusing on a process, you might adjust slightly depending on what you need. But in the beginning, it's recommended to just get really familiar with the the sprint out of the box. Even the 4-day sprint of AJ and Smart. So unless you feel comfortable and are confident in your facilitation skills, it's good to give yourself a little bit of extra time. People can use that time to really think through the problem, explore the problem, the same thing with the solution. Whereas AJ and Smart really compresses it into 4 days. And that puts a lot more pressure as a facilitator to make sure you're getting the outcomes from each of the different activities. Because really, they're actually still using all of the activities. It's just really compressed in terms of timing. So day 1 is all about exploring the problem. And you really focus on bringing in that data, kind of understanding, okay, what is the challenge that we're going to work through? What are if you're working on something that, let's say, has an end user, for example, so if it's like a digital app, then you might actually bring in people who have done some user research and interview them, and you want to be able to actually get some of that data. But really the first activity is looking at, okay, what's the long-term goal? What are we actually trying to achieve? So in 2 years' time, if we're highly successful, what would that look like? And getting everybody aligned on that. And then interviewing some people, kind of understanding what are some of the things that are working, what are some of the obstacles that are in our way, what are, how do we reframe those into, let's say, problem statements or challenges. We use kind of this the design thinking tool of how might we statements, where we actually take the problem, we reframe it into a question that includes the need, but also an insight that's interesting. So maybe what makes it the most challenging, for example, or why it's difficult, or what the gain is. And then we take those problem statements and we overlay them on top of a journey or a visualization. So it's very common to use a customer journey map or a user journey map and look at the current state and then kind of take those problem statements and overlay it on top of the user journey. But you can replace this with whatever visualization tool or map makes the most sense depending on what you're working on. So if it's a product, maybe it's a journey map. If it's a process, it might be something else. But you ultimately just want to create a visualization and then that way be able to visualize the goal, the actors, the steps that they're taking, and then any of the problems or opportunities that resonate the most. Ultimately, at the end of day 1, you're going to select kind of a target area in that visualization in terms of where you're going to focus. So of course, if we had a customer's journey, Perhaps there's lots of challenges across that journey, but we're going to say, okay, for this sprint, we're going to focus perhaps on, let's say, retention. Maybe retention is the #1 issue, and as a team, we're going to focus in this particular area. So to help you, yeah, I can share the mural board if you guys want to hop in. And I will share all the templates and mural boards afterwards as well. But if it's easier for you guys to see by coming in, then you can do that as well if you don't want to follow along inside of. So I'll just post this up. So the goal on day 1 is to really explore the challenge and then pick a particular target area and a focus that is going to set up for the rest of the sprint. And then day 2 now is going to be about exploring solutions. And when we're looking at exploring solutions, we want to go, so like using design thinking approaches where we diverge and then, look at many different ideas, kind of explore or let things emerge in terms of potential ideas. So pick a few, explore them, and then converge. So, choose and make some decisions, choose a couple of ideas that we then want to prototype and test. So that double diamond loop in terms of open thinking, exploration, and then closed thinking is a common pattern in design thinking, and it's actually heavily used inside of the sprint. So even in day 1, when we were exploring problems, we're diverging and then converging by selecting a target. Day 2, we're kind of doing the same thing. So we're at the beginning, we're giving people an opportunity to demonstrate things that they like in terms of their ideas. So we do what's called lightning demos, where people actually say, okay, I really like the way that this app handles the retention issue. And then each individual will actually show a particular thing that they like about maybe an app in another domain, or another product or process in another domain. So it's looking for lateral thinking, where we kind of, go beyond the regular ideas that we come up with as an organization, because we're now starting to explore other applications, other uses in other domains. So it's a really great technique to get people, each individual, to be able to contribute and to also explore solutions in other domains that we can then leverage inside of the problem or the challenge that we're working on. So we give some time to lightning demos, and then afterwards we go through a 4-step sketch. And so this process is about, again, kind of exploring lots of different options. So we spend some time, looking at the problem statements, looking at people's ideas that they shared through lightning demos, exploring different ideas. It makes use of a lot of individual alone time. So the concept here is to really pull the creativity out of people, so that you don't necessarily need to rely on one genius or one Steve Jobs. You can leverage the room and leverage the people within the room to come up with lots of different ideas. And they do that by first just starting to jot down some notes that really focuses on the challenge and focuses on some of the things that they've heard to date. And then afterwards, actually starting to sketch out a few different ideas. We do a warm-up activity called Crazy Eights, and that warm-up activity just gets their brain kind of thinking beyond just the ordinary ideas or ordinary solutions, to try and just kind of push beyond the obvious, push beyond the ordinary. And then finally, they create what's called a 3-step sketch. So they do this on their own, and they kind of create a bit of an outline in terms of what's happening in the beginning, what's happening in the middle, and what's happening at the end. And then this is really supposed to be their moment to allow their idea to hang on its own in terms of, kind of, it's an anonymous, it's not necessarily somebody selling their idea. We're trying to remove as much bias as possible, but basically they create this 3-step sketch. And then what happens is the next day when we start to go through it, to go through the different ideas, is that we're basically looking at all of them on their own merit, right? So people do spend some time. We give them at least 45 minutes to an hour, even a little bit more, to make sure that the sketch is something that can actually be visualized, but really, words are important. So making sure that the information that's on the sketch can kind of present itself, and that you don't necessarily have to speak to it. So a lot of times kind of put towards that. Sometimes people get worried about the fact that they can't draw, but we kind of disarm that. We disarm some of that in terms of just making it really, as a facilitator, making it really easy for them not to worry about it. If you can draw lines and sticks, words are important, then that's really what's the most important thing. So it's amazing to see kind of what comes out as people get creative and as people really start to put some of these sketches together. So day 3 is all about converging, and now it's making some decisions. And so we do an art gallery at the beginning of day 3 where all of the different sketches are up on the board and people walk through the different sketches. They actually start to create a bit of a heat map. So we give them lots of votes. There's really no limit. They put as many dots as they want on the aspects of the different ideas that they like. So if they like a particular feature, they'll put a dot on it, for example. And so we'll create this kind of art museum and this heat map. And then afterwards, as a facilitator, you walk through and you explain to everybody, where the most interest lies. So you kind of walk through each of the different ideas and you say, okay, the big idea here is, X, Y, and Z. And then here's where people are interested in terms of maybe a particular feature. If there's questions, people can kind of ask questions. But again, this is still an opportunity for the facilitator to really make an impact in terms of people are voting on ideas based on their merit and not necessarily based on who the individual was that's perhaps trying to sell the idea, for example. So it can be very powerful, very effective. Ultimately, the decider will make the final decision. So apart from the facilitator, the other key role that exists in the design sprint is the role of a decider. Now, for the most part, the process is democratized, but ultimately we have somebody who's got stake in the final outcome and also perhaps has a lot of information that's helpful to really make some decisions that are key for us to continue moving forward in the sprint. And that is the role of the decider. So the decider will have the final outcome. They'll pick the idea that's going to get prototyped. Sometimes they'll pick 2 ideas. So there might be what we call a rumble, where we like 2 ideas and we want to see how customers react. So if we have the capacity and if we can prototype 2 ideas, then we'll actually pull those 2 ideas in. And then finally, at the end of day 3, we're building out a storyboard. And so the storyboard is just creating a plan for the prototyping team. So imagine if there was a separate team coming in to build a prototype, then what would that storyboard look like? And basically we just create 8 panels, and each panel will represent something that we need to build for the prototype. Now the reality is you don't always have a separate prototyping team that's coming in on day 4. So it's still the same team really, but the concept is the same. Like, what information is going to go where, and thinking like if we did have another team that they could just simply take this as a plan and then make it happen. So that's really the goal there. So basically, by the end of day 3 now, you have an idea that you want to prototype and you've got a storyboard on how to make that happen. And then day 4 is all about building the prototype. So, you want to create a prototype that's got some high fidelity. So now the tools these days are fantastic in terms of being able to, really kind of replicate the experience or replicate the scenario. And so really leveraging those prototyping tools can be quite powerful and helpful. And then putting that, ultimately the goal is to put that in front of real people on the final day, which is where we actually do the testing. So on the final day when we're doing the testing, if you have a neutral facilitator or an interviewer that's impartial, so somebody who doesn't have a stake in the outcome and can really ask questions from the customer or the people who you're interviewing, that can be quite powerful. Recording the session is helpful, and then the team is observing that session, just taking down any notes in terms of insights. So what did they like? What didn't they like? There was also the sprint questions. So at the beginning on day 1, we actually discussed what are some of the riskiest assumptions that we're making about this idea, and how do we convert those into questions? And those questions will be questions that we're going to be looking to get answered inside of the interview on day 5. And so ultimately we get some answers to those questions, which will then ultimately help us make the final business decision in terms of, what adjustments do we need to make, or if we're going to persevere, or if we're going to pull the plug. So the team will actually compile all of their insights together and then ultimately use that in a retrospective to be able to make a decision or make a recommendation back to the business. So that's the final day is doing the test and learn, and then also the retrospective. Now, I know I've covered off a lot of things, and there's definitely some questions inside of the chat. So I'm going to move to a Q&A session. The biggest thing that you're doing virtually is you got to make sure that you're prepared with your templates. So we found a lot of success in having a canvas for each day. So day 1 canvas, day 2 canvas, day 3 canvas. Making sure that, you know, those templates are prepared, and trying not to book 8 hours for the virtual session. So if you can, do half days. So for example, you know, do 3 or 4 hours and then do some offline work. So what I mean by offline work is, you know, the sketches you don't have to do online with everyone, right? The sketches, people can do that offline. They can sketch it on a piece of paper on their own time. So whether they want to do that in the afternoon or they want to do that in the evening, and then they can take a picture of the sketch. And as long as it's there for the next morning, then it's fine. So because there's a lot of individual work inside of sprints, that individual work translates really nicely to offline work. So where you do need to do the online work is when you're doing like the decision making, for example, or you're doing the voting. So any of those activities you want to do online and make sure you got your boards prepared. But the other individual work, you can do that offline, and that makes it a bit easier to do, to still keep the 5-day sprint, but do it virtually, especially keeping people's energy up and keeping people engaged and motivated. So that's the biggest recommendation, is making sure that you've got your templates, you know, paying attention to people's energy by adjusting the agenda to do offline and online. That's the biggest recommendation I have. Okay, great question. So imagine design thinking as like a philosophy. So if you think about, like, I guess, you know, one way that you might resonate more with you, Nawaz, is if you think about Agile has like a set of values and principles. But there's also like even an Agile like methodology, right? So doing this iterative and incremental development. And then if you imagine Scrum kind of comes along, and then Scrum is a little bit more prescriptive in the sense that it says, okay, you've got some roles and you've got these events that you need to do. And so it's kind of the same idea. So, you know, design thinking has got lots of different potential methods and tools that you can use. It's got a set of principles. It's also got some recommendations in terms of phases that are also supposed to be iterative. But then, you know, design sprints come along and is a bit more prescriptive. In fact, actually, design sprints are even more prescriptive than Scrum, because design sprints take design thinking and take, you know, the methods and, let's say, the tools and the principles, and then give you a very specific workshop format that tells you exactly what to do. So it's almost like liberating structures. So imagine if you take some liberating structures and you link them together. That's what a design sprint is. So a design sprint takes a number of different workshop, like design thinking structures, and links them together. But ultimately, you know, design thinking is similar, and it says that, you know, think about the problem, define it so that you're clear on what it is, come up with some ideas, build a prototype, and then test those ideas. But it doesn't tell you like what the workshop is in order to do that. And design sprints actually tell you the workshop and give you the activities in order to make that happen. What are some good challenge statements? That's a great question, Peter. Actually, I could probably show you some examples, but if you think about, like, a lot of times what tends to happen is we're perhaps working on let's say a product, for example. Like if you use a product as an example, and you might have a product that's supposed to achieve certain outcomes, right? So maybe this product is supposed to get customers, let's say, to you know, make it easier for them to add more items to their shopping cart, let's say, right? Or a particular outcome. And it's just not doing that. So for whatever reason, you know, the data is saying like, hey, something is dropped, people aren't, you know, reacting to a certain situation, and it's a challenge, for example. And so sometimes it can be helpful to actually to understand that, to say, okay, look, you know, here's kind of the challenge statement. This product is supposed to do X for these people, and it's no longer doing X for these people as measured by Y. And so understanding the outcomes like X, and then understanding how they're measuring those outcomes, Y, going into the sprint can be very powerful. And that can be the challenge, right? So now we know, okay, that this is a product that we're going to focus on. So we kind of know what we're going to be focused on in the sprint. We know generally who the people are, and we also know the outcomes and the measurements that we're using. If you've got those 4 things in terms of your challenge, the classic situation is we're trying to avoid solutioning. So it's like anything else, right? We want to try not to have the idea already baked into the challenge statement. So you don't want a challenge statement that's too narrow, that's got the solution, but you also don't want it too broad where you have no idea exactly what you're trying to move the needle on. Now, sometimes people will have an idea. They have an idea and they just want to test that idea, and that's okay too. But I think it's just being clear about that kind of upfront. So, but yeah, so I think in that instance, that could be a good challenge statement, is just making sure, like, who are the main audience? What are the outcomes? How do we know that it's a problem? So like, how are we measuring that today? And is this a product that we're going to be working with? Is it a process, or is it a service, for example? So just being clear about that. I do find the deliverables, like in terms of what is the expectation coming out of the sprint, making sure that the leaders are aligned on that. So if we're coming out with, like, there's no guarantee of success, but there is going to be really good data to tell us where to go. That can be helpful in making sure that they understand that, and that we're really kind of, we're prototyping something and we're testing, and that's going to be the deliverable. So just being clear about that, getting some alignment before going into the sprint as well. Okay, good question. Honestly, I haven't found any difference between remote and in person when it comes to the type of challenge. I think the tools now are pretty good in terms of working on a design sprint remotely, like so using Mural, using Zoom, making sure that the board in Mural is set up. So there is a lot of preparation that goes into facilitating it virtually. But then afterwards, I think the challenge can be the same. So you don't necessarily have to take on a smaller challenge. I think just getting the challenge right. So Peter's question around getting the challenge right, that's the art and the science, is framing that challenge and just making sure that it's not too narrow and not too broad. That's what I found in my experience. So that's a really good way to do it virtually. So if you're doing this, remember how I was saying like some online and offline work? So actually recording the expert interviews, and then just people can watch them on their own time, and make it a prerequisite. So before coming into the sprint, make sure that you've watched the expert interviews. So you can do that for sure, and that would actually save some time, so that day one of your sprint, you don't have to spend 8 days exploring the challenge. You can actually spend just 3 or 4 days, because people have already watched the interviews on their own time and jotted down some notes. So I would say if you're not doing it in person and you're doing it virtually, then record the interviews and just get them to watch it on their own time. Yeah, so you want the deliverable to be a bit more narrow, because you're right. Like if we're solving, let's say you work at Netflix and they've got a retention issue with their people, but that retention issue could be lots of different things. It could be like customer support. It could be, the product. It could be, so going into the sprint, you just want to be clear. Like, are we going to focus on the product, and are we actually going to focus on a prototype perhaps with the product? So we're changing the product maybe to actually improve it to solve this particular issue. So that could be a feature, but it's not necessarily going to be completely wide open. So there is some scope that you're going to want to give the team. And that way the team knows that they're coming out of the sprint, like building a prototype, for example, something that's tangible that they can actually use. So if you have that conversation beforehand, that'll make it definitely a lot easier going into the sprint. So think about it like working software. A lot of quote unquote agile teams look at building working software. For them, their deliverable at the end of their sprint is working software, and that's the same thing. So if we're getting clear, like what's our deliverable at the end of the sprint? Is it like a working prototype? Is it a roadmap? Is it a PowerPoint presentation? Like what are we actually expected as a team to create coming out of the sprint? And you just want to make sure that that's a little bit clear. And that goes back to Peter's point, so that when leaders are, maybe your leaders or customers or whoever you're putting it in front of, that everybody's at least aligned on what that looks like.